Hello, punks. So, the blaring foghorn of Games Workshop has sounded once again with another announcement from Warhammer the Old World, this time about combat. But before we get into that, I thought I'd tell you something about my class today in Transcendental Meditation and Jaegic Flying. And in that class, my instructor said that in order to experience joy, happiness, and harmony, to unlock the apotheosis of a higher state of harmonic convergence, that I should look at something that brought me joy. And of course, there could be no other candidate than the Third Ed rulebook, where it all began. But then I realized that the power of good would be impotent if not for the contrast of evil, and I saw this wretched piece of garbage on my bookshelf alongside it. This document that claimed that introducing points values was some kind of revolutionary new science. And then I realized that everything to do with this announcement, and indeed Warhammer the Old World in general, could be distilled into one simple, fundamental maxim. So, punks, repeat after me. Third Ed good, Age of Sigmar bad. Alright, punks, it's table time. And I should say that I found this announcement to be rather thin in its content, or at least based on being able to decode mysterious smoke signals which had been emanating from the high and mighty tower which we were all craning our necks to look up to. And so much of what I'm saying is just speculation. But hey, speculating's fun, so speculate we may. So, before they started talking about tables, they said a little bit about initiative order and striking first. So, in editions 1 to 7 of Warhammer Fantasy, if you charged, you struck first. This was a simple and irrefutable law of nature. But in 8th Ed, everything changed. And then it was the initiative order who struck first. So even if you were a knight with a great long lance, ploughing into a unit of Ponzi Phoenix guards, they'd wake up with an initiative of 6, puffing away on their Marlboro cigarettes, with rerolls to hit of course, and kill most of your knights before they can even swing. And that was unfortunate. But now, things are changing, because it's going to be initiative orders still, but yet chargers are going to receive an initiative bonus. Just like in 9th Age, where if you charge, you get a +1 agility or initiative bonus. I really like this. This is probably one of the mechanics I was really hoping they were going to bring in. We also have the potential of getting larger initiative bonuses on the flank and the rear as well. Perhaps these might be associated with different weapons. Maybe a lance gives you an initiative bonus as a charger. Maybe a spear or a pike gives you an initiative bonus as a receiver. And so who strikes first could be a really interesting kind of interaction, which balances, I think, the importance in simulating that a charging unit does get to strike up the initiative chain, so to speak, but also that there might be certain circumstances where a receiving unit might also get to swing in advance. I think that's a really cool additional level of detail which is achieved by being open to a little bit more complexity, something they've repeatedly shown themselves to be willing to do. Then we get on to one of these tables, and this is again a thing of beauty for exactly the same reason as we saw with the To Wound table on the shooting announcement. Now, this table has gone a little bit Third Ed. Yes, that again. Casts a long shadow, does Third Ed. Because the hit table is identical to what it used to be, with the exception of 2s to hit being a thing. In the past, if the opponent's weapon skill was more than double yours, it would be 5 to hit, like a goblin with initiative 2, weapon skill 2, swinging at a Chaos Warrior with weapon skill 5. But now, when the Chaos Warrior swings at the goblin, instead of needing 3s to hit, because his weapon skill is more than double that of the goblin, it's going to be 2s. So there's another interesting little dynamic there, which also I think slightly redresses the fact that in Warhammer, generally strength and toughness were more important than weapon skill in the past. In other words, it was generally better to be stronger than it was to be more skillful. Now I think that's been changed, both by having 2s to hit, which is making weapon skill great again, and by decoupling strength from armor penetration. And so we might see a resurgence of fighters who aren't necessarily that strong, but are very skillful, and perhaps they might be hitting on 2s and have quite high armor penetration, even though their strength is relatively low. So this part of the announcement, fantastic. I'm really pleased to see 2s to hit, and a nice little piece of artwork there of 2 knights charging at each other, maybe both claiming large initiative bonuses from their lances. We then have a table on calculating the combat result. Really, there's not so much that's new here to see. All of the old modifiers that we've seen in previous Warhammer editions are all here. And so someone who likes 8th edition or indeed prior editions is going to be pleased. You get points for ranks, points for standard, battle standards, kills, overkills in a challenge, etc. Now, one thing that I am a little bit concerned about, and one thing that there's just a big question mark about, is how ranks and frontages are going to interact. Now, we have been told, and again in this announcement, that all of the models in the front rank can swing. And that would therefore mean that in order to maximize your number of attacks, especially given you only get the front rank fighting, that you're going to need to use very wide formations. Now, if you've got a frontage of, say, 10 models, especially if your models have got 2 attacks each, like Chaos Warriors or Swordmasters, I think one would infer that the biggest determinant of who wins combat will be the body pile rather than the ranks. If ranks are only +1 and you're having a lot of casualty removal, then I slightly worry that perhaps ranks are a bit less important, especially because we haven't really had any much indication of steadfast, apart from one important detail that we will see below. So we'll have to see how that interacts. Superficially, it looks as though wide frontages might be more advantageous, but there's still a lot that we don't really know. So wait and see on that score, I'm afraid, a bit half-baked. We then see, I think, by far the most and revolutionary of these tables, and indeed perhaps one of the most important single things we've seen from this game so far, which is about the determinants of combat. Now, in Warhammer, because you can break and flee if you lose combat and die completely, be wiped out if your pursuers catch you, this is a really important game mechanic. Upon a unit breaking and then being caught, most battles of Warhammer Fantasy have usually turned. Now, with this we see that there are in fact 3 potential outcomes to a combat rather than only 2. In the past, all there was, assuming the combat wasn't a draw of course, was if the unit who lost held, or broke and fled, and then whether they were caught or managed to escape. Now there are 3. Now, if a unit is beaten in combat, and it rolls higher than its natural leadership, it breaks and flees, and can be pursued, and the wholesale can be butchered, just like in the old days. Note that it seems that higher than this leadership isn't dependent on ranks, and so perhaps steadfast and the way in which that gave you a automatic leadership value that was the same as your leadership, not modified by combat, maybe that seems to be out, or at least there's no evidence that it's in, which is another reason why I'm a little bit concerned about ranks not counting so much. But in a sense, every unit has a form of steadfast, in that you will not be breaking and fleeing unless you roll under your natural leadership rate, and presumably you've got a general and a battle standard bearer there as well. So relatively seldom, except when there is a real spike on the dice, are you going to see units breaking and fleeing in this game, and that is an absolutely huge change. So, what happens instead? Well, there are 2 things, and neither of those are the same as what happened before. So, if you pass your leadership test on its modified roll, in other words, if I beat your unit by 3 and you've got a leadership of 9 and you roll a 6 or less, you're allowed simply to give ground, i.e. to be pushed back. There's another mechanic there from 3rd Ed. And from what I can infer from these rules, the victorious unit follows up and gets to fight another round of close combat. Or perhaps they don't have to follow up. It's not entirely clear whether that's the case or not. So you could potentially have combats being broken up even in the result of neither side being eliminated or fleeing, which would be a very fascinating dynamic. Now, if you fail your leadership test that with modifiers applied, but pass it on your natural leadership, you're allowed to do something called fall back, or the rather pompously titled fall back in good order. So what this appears to mean is simply that you fall back in the same way as if you were pushed back. Perhaps it's a different distance, but the unit who has beaten you will get its charging bonus in the next round of combat. So if you're a knight and you're claiming a +2 strength bonus with a lance, you clearly have an advantage in the next round of combat against a unit that has fallen back compared to one which gave ground voluntarily. Although I suppose for weapons that don't have a charging bonus, apart from this initiative bonus we're likely to get, perhaps a unit that's following up doesn't have that much of an additional advantage if it's following up against a falling back unit or against a giving ground unit. Again, this is all speculation, because we don't know how far units fall back or give ground, and we don't really know about the mechanics of what happens to the victorious unit. Also, we don't know when combats actually happen. So, if a unit falls back, does the unit that pursues them then get to fight yet another round of close combat, and a massive push-a-thon occurs all over the battlefield, or is that charge resolved in the opponent's turn? So, if my lance charges your spearman, and you fall back, or you give ground, let's say you fall back, and then you charge my lance with some halberdiers, say, in the side, what happens there? Do my knights count as charging and your halberdiers count as charging, and all claim their charging bonuses? Presumably yes. Now, of course, there is some precedent for that in the existing rules. If you overran or pursued into a new enemy unit in 8th ed, or in previous editions, it counted as a fresh charge in the next hand-to-hand combat phase. Although, rather complicatedly, if there was another combat that you could resolve, that you hadn't resolved yet, and you ploughed into fresh enemy, your troops could actually fight twice and trigger a cascading combat, something you only tended to really see generally in fairly high-level play. Again, no real indications of how and when these combats will be triggered. And so, the fact that you've got all those potential options there, absolutely intriguing. It also means that combats are going to result in troops moving around rather than gumming up one place on the battlefield. Potentially, given that we've not got proper breaking and fleeing in the sense of modified leadership values, presumably these push-a-thons could go on for a very long time. So if my unit charges yours, say in turn 2, and it's a 6-turn game, potentially I could push your unit, 10 inches, 20 inches? Maybe I could push you off the board and you'll die. Maybe I could push you into some other units of mine that I'd got round behind you. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Pushing a unit of infantry with a lance, and there being some mounted yeomen behind them to cut them down. Unfortunately, we can only speculate about what all these things might mean. In 3rd ed, there was also the mechanic of the free hack as well for units that gave ground. In other words, a single automatic hit on those who were retreating. That would also be something, potentially, that could be there in the mix. But again, we merely can speculate. Now, apart from that, and apart from the confirmation of many other things like sort of overruns, etc., which seem to pretty much be the same as before, there are again 2 of these spells. Now, the spells, as I have said before, are the places where I feel the most pessimistic about what I have read. And there are 2 of them here, which are called assailment spells. In other words, they get cast in the combat phase. Now, it doesn't say when in the combat phase they need to be cast. It would be a bit strange if the assailment spells could be cast after the combats had happened, so presumably they have to happen before. And then what exactly would occur? If this hammer hand spell is cast before combat, do the models that die get removed from the front rank and are therefore not able to strike, and are they removed from the back rank? Incidentally, I neglected to mention that. We haven't been told if step up is still in or not. In other words, if I kill you before you swing, do those casualties come off the front rank and reduce the number of attacks coming back at me, or do they get pulled off the back rank, as they were in 8th ed? I would guess and infer it's probably the latter, which is a bit simpler, especially in a game where we're pushing combat units all over the place, which adds another layer of complexity. Now, as to these spells. Now, the first thing I thought about these spells, which are called Hammer Hand and Soul Eater, was the casting value. 7+ again. Further confirmation, I think, that if any were needed, it's going to be one of those Age of Sigmar kind of systems of rolling 2d6 and beating a number. Boo. I think that's a mistake. But the actual spells themselves, can I say much about them? Well, yes, I think I can. Namely, that they both sound crap in a competitive sense. Now, of course, I don't really know that because I don't know what other mechanics there are in this game. But the Hammer Hand spell. So, both of these spells require the wizard to be in combat with the enemy. Now, in any kind of fantasy game, a very great premium should be placed on a spell where a wizard has to get his soft body in the way of potential enemy chopping. I.e., that spell needs to be very, very good in order to make it worth the risk to the wizard, when he could just be standing at range and blasting people. So the Hammer Hand, which seems to be rather lousily written, as the battle mage chants an invocation, their fists become like hammers, falling upon their foes with great and terrible power. That sounds a bit ChatGPT to me, but anyway. So what does it do? Well, a single unit takes 2d3 strength 4 hits with an AP of 2. 2d3, that's interesting, not d6, 2d3. So a little bit there of the flattening of potential spikes between 1 and 6. Now, the difference would be between 2 and 6. That doesn't sound particularly powerful, though, as I say, for a mage being in combat. The Soul Eater sounds even worse from this new law of dark magic. So, a single enemy model that the target is engaged with takes a strength 3 hit with the multiple wounds 3, and you get wards and regen against it. Again, that doesn't really sound like enough bang for my buck to put my squishy wizard on the front line, especially against a multiple wound target that's likely to have quite a few attacks. I think we can maybe infer from all of the spells we've seen that magic is getting a major nerf, that this is an anti-magic edition. Good news for corn demons, good news for dwarves. Rather less good news for Tectless and his buddies. So, I think that weaker magic, well, that's going to be something to quite a lot of people's tastes. Not mine. I think that magic, yes, I think some of the spells in 8th ed, in 4th ed, in 5th ed, a few in 6th ed were a bit too strong, but generally I liked the power of magic to be able to have really big impacts in games. This sounds like it's a very much augmenting kind of magic, wizards doing a little bit here and there to give their troops additional advantages and having some marginal effects around the edges, rather than real moments happening in games where a wizard can cast a potentially battle-winning spell. I don't mean just dialing through the cheeseometer and 6-dicing a purple sun. There are quite a lot of other instances where spells could potentially turn games, and I'm not sure that any of the spells I've seen so far sound as though, even in the most extreme situations, they could potentially turn a game of Warhammer. They sound quite marginal. Now, of course, one thing we don't know is how often the wizards get to cast. If they're casting throughout the spell, I suppose it's a little bit like they've got a bag of licorice all sorts with lots of small sweets in, rather than one massive purple-coloured Easter egg that they're going to throw at the enemy once the game. So perhaps the power of magic is just a little bit more constant and just a little bit more subtle. We may speculate on that point. It also seems as though, because these spells are called things like battle magic and dark magic, that there doesn't seem to be anything in the way of colleges of magic. And that all seems, well, historically understandable, but perhaps a little bit vanilla and a little bit basic for my tastes. So, pretty much that's a wrap. Mostly speculation, I'm afraid, although there are a few things in there that are interesting, especially this cable about calculating the combat results and what happens in it. The only real way of being able to see what happens with that will be to actually play the game and see how it all interacts. Certainly, it's intriguing. There can be no question about it that they haven't been risk-averse in the way they have written this game. They've taken mechanics from 3rd ed, really from 3rd ed, that wasn't just window dressing, and Warhammer Ancients, and the 9th Age, and have melded them together to create something that really does feel genuinely new. And, well, it's risky. But in sticking their neck out, I think we should be very much giving them the best chance to make this game really successful and potentially really good. Of course, in dicing, with this potentially rather radical kind of approach, there is the potential for catastrophe. There is the potential that it might all be garbage. But at least they're trying, and we can't fault anyone for that. Alright, punks. I think we've reached the end of the road for this one. Do you remember what I said just there? Do you remember the maxim about 3rd ed and about Age of Sigmar? Well, all I've got to say to you is repeat that every day before bed, and it will make you a calmer, better, and happier person. See you next time, and good night.